It is abundantly clear that there is no transparency, or very little of it, in and of course on accountability for how we manage these abundant resources. Consequently, in the midst of plenty, majority of the people remain poor. I have urged African governments to stop securing loans backed by their natural resources. And that's because those natural resource-backed loans are not transparent. They're expensive. They make debt resolution very, very difficult. If that trend continues, it will be a disaster for Africa. Now, some speak about natural resource curse. They say that if you have natural resources, somehow you are going to be on a trajectory where you are going to be poor. I don't think the issue is the natural resources, that is the natural resource curse. I think it's a curse of leadership. It's a lack of leadership. How can it be that what's supposed to make you rich makes you poor? I don't buy this. The so-called natural resource curse has not applied to Saudi Arabia. It has not been relevant to Qatar, nor to Norway. I was there recently on a panel with their Minister of International Development, talking about $1.3 trillion of assets under management that they have from their own resources, which is the same oil that we have. Now, ladies and gentlemen, these are all nations that are rich in natural resources that have served them very well. Now, why should it be different for Africa's natural resource-rich countries? It all comes down to governance, transparency, accountability, and sound management of our natural resources. If we manage our natural resources well, Africa has no reason to be poor. We have $6.2 trillion of natural resources. So how in the world are we poor? We simply need to pull up our socks, stamp our corruption, and manage our natural resources in the interest of our countries and in the interest of our people. And let me say, the resources of a country does not belong in the pockets of powerful and rich individuals. It belongs for the state to be used for the benefit of the people of that country. There must be accountability on our natural resources. I wonder sometimes when people go around and say, well, I've actually helped, we put a borehole in our state, or put a borehole and it's on national television. The very fact that you're actually installing boreholes is an indication of government failure. Because in 21st century, every single house must be having pipe-borne water. So there's nothing to be really delightful about in trying to do that. And we should get away from this feeling of leaders feeling that they are doing public good. No. Leaders must be held accountable for the resources of the people. Africa will gain respect when it is able to feed itself. Any nation or region that begs for food is free only in words, but dependent on others for life. Feeding 9.5 billion people in the world by 2050 will be a big challenge, given climate change and a limited amount of cultivated arable land left in the world in many countries. Africa will play a critical role in this, and that's because Africa has 65% of the remaining uncultivated arable land in the world. And that means that what Africa does with agriculture will determine the future of food in the world. Now, but despite this, Africa has not been able to feed itself. Africa's food import bill hit $85 billion in 2021. It's expected to surpass $110 billion by 2025, with 283 million Africans going to bed every day hungry. Now, we are changing this narrative. Of course, when you got a president of the African Development Bank coming with an agriculture background, what do you expect? The African Development Bank has invested over $8 billion in agriculture over the past 7 years, which has improved the food security for 250 million people. When the Russian-Ukraine war broke out and disrupted wheat and maize export, Africa faced a potential food crisis. I said, and many of you may remember when I was Minister of Agriculture here, I said it at a time in 2012 when we had a really disastrous flood. Dr. Abati will remember my statement at the time. I said we will not have a food crisis. And we didn't have a food crisis. We managed it well. In fact, we did the nation's first dry season farming program, which produced so much food like you've never seen before. And by March of the next year, we had produced so much food that the price of food collapsed. Inflation went down. And so I said the same thing when we had this potential food crisis from Russia and Ukraine war. I said Africa will not see a food crisis. And that Africa should not go around begging for food or pleading with Russia to give it more food. But rather get bowls in its hand, put his own seed in those bowls, and plant those seeds for itself to grow the food with pride for itself. The African Development Bank rapidly approved $1.5 billion emergency food production facility for African countries. Today, this facility is supporting 20 million farmers in 36 countries to produce 38 million metric tons of food valued at $12 billion. Now, just for your information, the total amount that we will lose, we stood to lose from Russia invasion in Ukraine for the imports was 30 million metric tons of food. And that 8 million metric tons, more than that, 30 million metric tons of food that I'm talking about. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa did not beg. Africa produced more food, and Africa gained respect. Our support to Ethiopia helped it now to achieve self-sufficiency in wheat within just 4 years, turning it into a wheat exporting country. And we started here in Nigeria already in this dry season. There's absolutely no reason why Nigeria should not be a net exporter of wheat. To replicate this global success, the African Development Bank helped to organize this year in January, myself and President Macky Sall of Senegal, a Feed Africa Summit, which attracted 34 heads of state and government. Our leaders didn't just simply come there to speak. They committed to driving self-sufficiency and food sovereignty. I want to emphasize food sovereignty. Every time you need food, your neighbor may love you to death, but it's not your neighbor's responsibility to feed you. And any responsible father or mother, when it's time for dinner, can't all just say, well, just go to your neighbor's house. No, we must have pride and be able to feed ourselves. I'm glad to report that this landmark summit, we've been able to mobilize globally $72 billion to help Africa achieve these targets. But even as we do this, we must do more than simply produce more food and agricultural commodities. Take, for example, that Africa, which accounts for only 65% of the production of cocoa, only receives 2% of the total of $120 billion worth of global value of chocolates. Now, what's the brain surgery, you tell me, in making chocolates? While African farmers languish in poverty, chocolate processors smile all the way to the bank. One is condemned to penury. The others create wealth. The same can be said for cotton, tea, coffee, cashew, and other raw commodities that Africa exports at a significant loss in terms of revenue and jobs. Now, let me be very clear on two issues. The export of raw commodities is the door to poverty. The export of value-added products is a highway to wealth. To gain respect, Africa must turn itself into a global powerhouse in food and agriculture. That's why the African Development Bank and its partners have provided $1.6 billion for the development of what we call special agro-industrial processing zones. In fact, right here in Nigeria, we have put in place the same program in 8 states that are now being funded by the bank, Islamic Development Bank, and also International Fund for Agricultural Development, with more than almost $620 million devoted to Nigeria. And I received requests now to do this in 24 more zones, 25 more zones in Nigeria. And just to break down the technicality on this, what exactly do they mean? You go to rural areas today, there are zones of economic misery, and nothing there. infrastructure is concentrated in the urban areas. And yet we say majority of our people are in rural areas. The only way we are going to be able to get them out of poverty is if we turn the main business in which their lives depend into a real wealth-creating sector. And that cannot happen unless we have consolidated infrastructure and logistics that's going to make agriculture not only productive, efficient, competitive, money-making business that will drive all those people out of poverty into wealth. So these new zones are zones where we are going to put in roads, water, irrigation, storage, infrastructure, processing facilities, so that food and ag companies can locate there and bring new life there. If you are a minister of finance, listen to me what I'm saying today. Africa must go beyond the fiscal transfers of resources to rural areas. Africa must expand the fiscal space in its rural areas by turning those areas from zones of economic misery into zones of economic prosperity. And that can only happen through this kind of structural transformation. And I was delighted that at the Africa Investment Forum, which we had 2 weeks ago, that we launched a $3 billion alliance for special agro-industrial processing zones that will continue to do this in several countries. African countries, must turn the sweat of their farmers into wealth. Africa will gain respect when it takes advantage of its vast natural resources to develop its economies and transform the lives of its people. What applies to agriculture also applies to Africa's minerals, oil, gas, and metals, such as copper, cobalt, manganese, graphite, and lithium. Africa accounts for 70% of the global reserves of platinum, 52% of cobalt, 48% of manganese. If you take the DRC alone, Democratic Republic of Congo, it accounts for 70% of the global supply of cobalt. But listen to this. China accounts for the highest percentage of refining of these strategic minerals. Cobalt, 73%. Nickel, 68%. Lithium, 59%. Copper, 40%. So as the world transitions into renewable energy sources, Africa has the largest source of renewable energy in the world. That renewable energy revolution will depend on these critical minerals for the manufacturing of wind turbines, solar panels, battery energy storage systems, and electric vehicles. There is so much money to be made because the size of the electric vehicles market is estimated to rise from $7 trillion today. And between now and 2030, if you combine that with the battery energy systems, storage system, it will be $8 trillion. And that will rise to $57 trillion by 2050. It's going to be a 500% increase in demand for cobalt, graphite, and lithium by 2025. Therefore, Africa must strategically position itself in this rapidly growing global battery storage and electric vehicle value chains. We did a study we supported from the bank to look at the manufacturing of lithium-ion precursor batteries in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And we tried to compare that with China and Poland. And we found that if you were producing that in the Democratic Republic of Congo, it would be 3 times cheaper than manufacturing in China, United States, or in Poland. And therefore, Africa must develop these value chains in order to process, add value, and become well integrated into global supply chains. Of course, we must not forget there are real geopolitical issues and interests that drive international engagements on these critical metals. But Africa should strategically position itself to build its own industrial manufacturing capacities with infrastructure, with skills, with knowledge, competencies, and investment partnerships. Africa's green metals must become Africa's green wealth. Africa will gain respect when it becomes an important player in global manufacturing. Today, Africa accounts for just 3% of the global manufacturing. Industrializing is the fastest way to wealth. And here, once again, permit me to focus on my home country, Nigeria especially. Nigeria must unleash an industrial revolution on this continent. The day Nigeria wakes up and becomes a Lion King like you had in the Lion King movie, everything will change for its people, and everything will change for all of Africa. Malaysia and Vietnam have used aggressive horizontal and vertical diversification of industrial production to move from low value to high value market products. The result is reflected in their wealth status. Malaysia's export value per capita is $7,100. For Vietnam, $3,100. For Nigeria, $160. So while Malaysia and Vietnam have long moved into global manufacturing growth, they are creating explosive wealth and jobs for themselves. Nigeria, meanwhile, has remained in a survival mode. Sadly, Nigeria is still unable to replace its imports of petroleum products, despite being one of the largest exporters of crude oil in the world. For now, Nigeria is developing way too slowly and far below its potential. I am very hopeful that the current administration, under His Excellency President Bola Ahmed Tinubu, and I have followed a lot of the statements being made by the government, I am quite hopeful that it will help to revive Nigeria's manufacturing sector. And I'm here, I'm glad that the Special Representative President is here. It's very, very important. Industrial manufacturing is the way we are going to pull ourselves out of this morass of poverty that should never be in this country. Now, everything that I've said so far about Africa coming into its own and reaching its full potential is undermined by a very strong manufacturing base. To get there, we must implement the right policies, make the right investments, get our infrastructure in order, improve logistics and financing frameworks. We must make sure that this is driven by a highly skilled and competent youthful workforce. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, Africa will gain respect when its voice is heard and respected as the world grapples with the greatest threat to human existence, that is climate change. Next week, the whole of the world will descend in the United Arab Emirates for COP28, the annual meeting of the Conference of Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. In fact, as soon as I finish this lecture, I'll be on my way to the airport to be on my way to that event. I came specifically just to honor you here on my way out there. So I can add my voice to Africa's call. Climate change is devastating many parts of Africa. Drought and desertification across the Sahel. And in the Horn of Africa, cyclones in Mozambique, Zimbabwe, Malawi, and Madagascar have had devastating effects. Africa, which accounts for only 3% of global emissions, now bears the disproportionate consequence of it. 9 out of the 10 most vulnerable countries of climate change are in Africa. Africa loses $7 to $15 billion a year to climate change, and if that continues, it's going to reach roughly almost $50 billion a year by 2030. Now, there's always a debate about the growth trajectory of nations. Now, while the developed countries grew very well, they created massive wealth, they did so with huge amount of externalities globally which they did not internalize. Their living standards went way up, but at the cost of the environment, because they simply used up 85% of the global carbon budget was used up by the developed countries. Africa's emissions are dwarfed by the emissions of other continents. Let me put that in perspective for you. If you're an American or an Australian, the amount of carbon that they actually emit per month is the same as an African emits for the whole year. And in many places, the amount of electricity used by a refrigerator in America or in other developed countries is more than an African will use for the whole of the year. But when we look at the global financing for climate change, I believe it is shortchanging. Senator, how are you? It's shortchanging Africa, providing only $29 billion out of the $653 billion in climate financing globally. To give voice to Africa's needs, the African Development Bank launched $25 billion Africa Adaptation Acceleration Program to deliver greater financing for Africa to adapt to climate change. In fact, as I'm going to UAE, we'll be launching a $1 billion climate risk insurance facility for adaptation that will allow us to insure African countries against extreme weather patterns, be it droughts, be it floods, be it cyclones, so that we don't have to constantly go through the vicissitudes of these things when they happen. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa will gain respect when it can provide universal electricity access to all of its people and drop the garb of being known as the dark continent. Africa, after all, has the largest renewable potential in the world, including solar, hydro, wind, and geothermal. The problem, of course, is we have 600 million Africans today that have no access to electricity. And we have 900 million Africans that cannot even afford decent cooking. We lose today 300,000 women every year. And what are they trying to do? Simply cook a decent meal for their families. 300,000 kids on their back lose their lives just because of secondary smoke they get from this particular situation. This cannot continue, and so I think we need to really look at this and say the global energy transition must recognize the realities of Africa. There has been a lot of underinvestment in Africa in energy. We get only 3% of the $3 trillion that have gone into renewable energy global investments, only 3% over the last 2 decades. And therefore, when it comes to renewable energy, Africa accounts for only 3% of the jobs being created by that globally. In my view, that is unfair, that is unjust, and that is unacceptable. And that's why when I became president, when I was elected president, first time in 2015, I launched what is called New Deal on Energy for Africa, to push so that we can get universal access to electricity. It's a hard work, but I'm glad to let you know that since that time, the average access, average across Africa, has moved from 32% to 57%. Now, there are some countries that are making remarkable progress. Ethiopia, Kenya. And if you go, for example, Morocco. In Morocco, the African Development Bank supported Morocco. Today in Morocco, they have 98% of all their rural areas they have 100% electrification rate. The African Development Bank, therefore, is at the forefront of unlocking Africa's renewable energy potential. We helped to finance in Morocco what's called Nu Wazazate. That's the largest concentrated solar power plant in the world. If you go to Kenya, you see the Lake Turkana project there. That's the largest wind power station in Africa. And right here in Nigeria, we've invested $210 million to develop the transmission lines. We are going to be supporting the state of Jigawa to develop 1,000 megawatts of solar power, which will be very big for this country. The governor of Lagos State, you hear, Governor Sanwo-Olu and I had a discussion in which the bank committed to supporting Lagos State to have the first public-private partnership transmission line in this country, and that's going to be right here in Lagos State. We're doing more than that. I did my master's thesis and PhD thesis when I was in the United States, living in Maradi in the Niger Republic. So when all these issues, Senator, was happening in the north and all that, Maradi is like my home base. And so, but I know that they don't have electricity there. And that's why the bank launched a $20 billion investment program to develop 10,000 megawatts of electricity all across the Sahel countries, including northern Nigeria, by the way, that will provide electricity for 250 million people. And when done, it will be the largest solar zone in the world. We've started in Burkina Faso, we started in Chad, we started in Mali, and we'll continue as soon as things allow us to do so. Now let me ask you just a question here about what you know about energy. Anybody know anything called INGA? Have you ever heard of it? Okay. You haven't heard about INGA. Okay. You should. Because INGA is the largest source of hydropower that Africa has. 44,000 megawatts potential in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But ever since I was in university, I've been hearing about INGA. So I went over there to see President Tshisekedi, and they took me to the site of INGA. And I asked them, why is this vast potential not being used? And they gave me all kinds of reasons. Then I got to the community where INGA was based, so I asked the population, can you tell me what the name INGA means? You know what they told me? They said the name INGA means yes. Yes, Y-E-S. So on my way out, they gave me the golden book to sign. And I put there, the African Development Bank says yes. Because with 44,000 megawatts of solar, they can be exporting power to Nigeria, to South Africa, to all of that. Why are we suffering in the middle of so much wealth? Yes, 100% electricity is the only thing that is acceptable and is the thing that we must achieve as a continent. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa will gain respect when it can secure the health of its own people. When COVID struck, Africa was caught unprepared due to several decades of underinvestment in health and the development of the pharmaceutical industry. You know, I should tell you, when I was a student in the University of Ife, you know, my professor who taught me about chemistry is sitting right in front of you here. Prof, can you stand up, please? Yeah. Professor Mollet taught me biochemistry. Never met a man more brilliant. He used to show up with no notes. And all those benzene rings and stuff like that, he grew them right into our brain. And I can never forget that his passion for biochemistry stays with me till today. You are a great man. Thank you, sir. Thank you, sir. But today, Africa produces 20 to 30% of its pharmaceutical products, 1% of its vaccines. And so when this issue of COVID started, it was for me very heart-wrenching to see African leaders going all over the world trying to find basic things, medicines, gloves, sanitizers, and masks. We were at the bottom of the value chain. And I said to myself, my staff are here, never again. To reverse that situation, the African Development Bank put up a $10 billion emergency facility. That facility allowed our countries to quickly recover from the impacts of the COVID-19 and allowed them to have access to all of this, sanitizers, masks, and the oxygen, and all the things that they needed. Now, how in the world did we come to a place where we externalized the health of our population? Where we then became dependent for 1.4 billion people's health on the benevolence of others. Now, what if others are not so benevolent? Now what will happen? And therefore we must manufacture more of our medications. When I was growing up in Nigeria, we used to have something called BOD products. We used to have all these good pharmaceutical companies here, but they are gone now. In fact, to manufacture these vaccines, you now need technologies and processes that are protected by intellectual property rights under the World Trade Organization. So you cannot actually have access to that. And so we decided as a bank to change that in 3 ways. First, we started investing $3 billion to revamp all the pharmaceutical plants in Nigeria, in Africa, including in Nigeria. We also have committed $3 billion to revamping the healthcare infrastructure in Africa. You know, if you get primary healthcare right, 85% of all of the problems are solved. But 50% of them have no access to electricity. Only 30% of them have access to water and sanitation. So we decided that we'll invest $3 billion in revamping all this infrastructure for all our primary, secondary, and tertiary healthcare facilities. But when it comes to the issue of vaccines, if you look at what has happened since COVID, a number of companies, global pharma companies, have come to Africa to set up manufacturing companies, which is good. However, they are fill and finish companies. In other words, you fill it, you package it, and then you sell it. It's like selling Coca-Cola. Right? But Coca-Cola, you may like drinking it like I do, at least I used to. Until my wife started telling me I was getting weight. But you cannot change the formulation because Africa's own epidemiological profile is very different. And therefore, we must have the scientific capacity, the innovative capacity, to be able to manufacture vaccines and pharmaceutical drugs that deals with our own epidemiological profile. And I was in Belgium when all African heads of state were there with all European heads of state. At the end of the meeting, Mr. Charles Michel, who is the chief president of the European Union Council, said, is there anybody that has a burning issue on their mind? Of course, my job, my duty, my calling, my responsibility is to be a vuvuzela for Africa's needs. And I put up my hand, I said, Your Excellency, I've got something on my mind. And what I have on my mind is, how are we going to make sure that African companies, pharmaceutical companies, can have access to the active pharmaceutical ingredients that they need, to the antigens that they need to manufacture vaccines? How in the world are we going to be able to do that? I can see Lady Ibro is trying to help me with my sweating. That's what happens when you wear a three-piece suit. It's not the bow tie, the bow tie is cool. So we decided, and I said, let's create what's called the Africa Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation that will intermediate between our local companies and the global pharma companies in access to intellectual property rights protected technologies and processes for making pharmaceutical drugs and vaccines. I'm glad to let you know that our foundation is now up and running. The office will be opened in Kigali next month on the 18th of December. I was able to get His Excellency President Kagame to chair the council of that foundation. And a very good friend of mine, Chancellor Merkel, the former Chancellor of Germany, I went to see her too because she's been really a great supporter of Africa. And she said, look, Akin, I've retired. And I'm not seeing anybody else. I'm writing my memoirs. But you, I will see. And I went over there, and she accepted to be the co-chair of that Africa Pharmaceutical Technology Foundation. $1 trillion, $2.6 trillion. So a healthier Africa will definitely be a much richer Africa. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, Africa will earn respect when it deepens good governance and the rule of law. You can clap better than that. For now, the erosion of the democratic space in several African countries is disturbing. The Mo Ibrahim Governance Index declined in 2022 and 2023. The return and the rise in the number of military coups in parts of Africa, especially the Sahel, poses a potent and imminent danger to reversing the continent's stability, growth, and development. Now, fixing this, because I lived there, I worked in Niger, Mali, Burkina Faso, Chad, everywhere, for many, many years. I know those places like the back of my hand. Requires a clear understanding that the Sahel region has continued to suffer for decades from climate change, desertification, and extreme poverty, and more recently from terrorism. Terrorists, ladies and gentlemen, don't just appear. They don't just appear. They thrive where three factors or drivers exist: extreme poverty, high youth unemployment, and climate and environmental degradation, what I call the disaster triangle. Anywhere you find this disaster triangle, be it the Horn of Africa, be it in the Sahel, terrorists, or in northern Nigeria, terrorists take over this place. Today, many of our countries are spending upward of 85% of their budgets on security. What's left? For development. And therefore, we must urgently and comprehensively tackle this challenge to prevent reversals of gains in development. This calls for strengthening of the overall security architecture. You know, let me just explain it so I don't get too technical. When countries don't have money to support themselves in a fiscal space that's very tight, they need new instruments. And I remember saying, as a president of a multilateral development bank, our job is to finance development. But here's the challenge. Today, 85% of Africans are living in or close to a country that is in conflict. And therefore, when I talk about we are financing development, we must be able to change our perspective to link security to investment, to growth, and development. It's an ecosystem that we must have new instruments that allow us to do that. And that's why I made the case to African heads of state that we will help to develop what is called security index investment bonds. These are new financial instruments that will allow African countries to access significant amount of resources on the global capital market to do four things for them. First, strengthen your security defense architecture. I'm not saying guns. We don't sponsor guns. We don't do bullets. No. But just your security capacity. Second, rebuild areas that have damaged infrastructure. Third, build social infrastructure, water, education, health, schools. And the reason why this is important is because when terrorists come to a place and they look like ungoverned spaces and forgotten spaces, they thrive in those environments. And finally, you go to Saudi Arabia and try to attack their oil fields. You can't. You go to Qatar and try to attack their gas fields. You can't. When the African Development Bank put together, during the Africa Investment Forum, a transaction worth $24 billion for Mozambique, liquefied natural gas, the largest foreign direct investment in Africa. Shortly after that, terrorists took over Cabo Delgado, of $24 billion investment. No, that can't happen in Saudi Arabia. That can happen in Qatar. That can happen anywhere. So the point I'm making is these new instruments will allow our countries to secure the zones in which they have strategic investments. That is very, very important. Coming right back at home, 2 weeks ago, I met with the 7 governors from the northwest of Nigeria. They came to see me in Abidjan. We discussed the challenges in northern Nigeria, northwest Nigeria. Today, with terrorism, poverty, unemployment, and degradation, it's heartbreaking to see what's going on there. And I told them that, look, we as African Development Bank salute the joint effort they are having, and we will strongly support them in agriculture, we'll support them in infrastructure, we'll support them on energy, and we'll support them to also deal with the issue of the pastoralist and farmer conflict that have actually dealt with many of the challenges we have today in Nigeria. Let me say that I hear often that we must have African solutions to African problems. It is loud and it is correct, but it will only be respected when Africa's problems are financed by Africa's resources. Political sovereignty must be backed by economic and financial sovereignty. Africa will earn more respect when it can mobilize financing for its own development. Today, you see high debt levels. Several countries rush to the capital markets to source cheaper loans to develop their economies, especially to invest in critical infrastructure. The number of countries that went to Eurobonds went from 2 to 21 between 2007 and 2022. They issued $140 billion of Eurobonds. Many of them went to China to get a lot more, but it's pay time now, and it's very difficult for many African countries. And right here in Nigeria, 98% of the government revenue is spent to service debt. Africa must find a better and more sustainable way to finance its development. We can do that if we manage our natural resources well. That's because the value of our natural resources is $6.2 trillion. We have no business not being able to finance our own development. Africa should not be a poor continent. It's high time for Africa, therefore, to truly assert its aspiration and move up from being a low-income, highly indebted set of nations and become a donor to less privileged nations. Global respect comes when nations do not overly depend on others. What do you see? You see country A, Africa's summit. Country B, with Africa's summit. Country C, with Africa's summit. Why? Africa is a continent. It should be the other way, where Africa brings those countries here to have a summit with Africa here. Not that we are traveling around the world at the beckon of a single person. That should not be. You don't get respect that way. Africa, if we can dream it, we can achieve it. Africa will earn respect, ladies and gentlemen, when its youth can be taken care of by Africa, and we can unleash the potential of our young people. Let me tell you a story. Just before I was elected president, a week after I was elected president of the bank, I went to a place called Gorée Island in Senegal. Gorée Island is a place where you have a door, a big door, they call it the door of no return. That's where they took all the slaves. And I stood over there in this place of the door of no return, and my mind was working about visions of those that they took out of this place. And when I got him back to my car, I began to reflect because I had a week to resume work. And I said to myself, those people they took out of these places were taken away against their volition. Today, young generations, Africa's best and brightest, strongest, are taking rickety boats with their own volition, heading into the Mediterranean Sea, many dying over there. This shouldn't be. We have a population of 477 million people between the ages of 15 and 35. We must harness that asset. We must. I picked up the paper, New York Times, and talked about the fact that the world is becoming more African. That's because the demography is changing. Most of it are going to be a lot of our young people. But I want to say that as we try to create more jobs for our people, of our young people, we have to realize that they are very talented. They don't need handouts. they need investment. I go around African countries, many tell me, Mr. President, we have a youth empowerment program. We have another youth empowerment program, but unfortunately, I've never had a young person walk up to me to say, I've been empowered. So I assume that those that are doing it are probably empowering themselves. And so I don't believe in all this youth empowerment business. Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying the youth shouldn't be lifted up. No, that's not what I'm saying. The youths don't need dollar. They don't need handouts. They need strategic investments in their skills, their knowledge, their entrepreneurship capacity, their businesses. We must create youth-based wealth. That's all we've got to do as a continent. And that is why at the African Development Bank, we're launching what's called Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks. Youth Entrepreneurship Investment Banks are new financial institutions that will do nothing but finance the businesses, the ideas, the enterprises of young people. They are going to be first-rate banks because they will finance those businesses in the life cycle of their businesses. These young people are going to dominate the world. Look at Nollywood. In fact, when I used to work at Rockefeller Foundation in the 90s, I was in Zimbabwe. And I entered my office. My staff was Julie, my secretary. And as I entered, it was about 1999, I think. And she said, "Good morning, sir." And I said, "Good morning." She said, so I said, "What was that?" She said, I said, "What happened?" She said, "Sir, that's what they do in Nollywood." I said, at that time, I didn't even realize that Nollywood had become something exported like that. I said, okay, Nollywood is good, but not that part of it. So in Nigeria, we launched something called IDICE, Digital Information and Creative Enterprises, $614 million that would allow the creation of 6 million jobs in Nigeria, digital and creative enterprises, that will add $6.4 billion to Nigeria's economy. As I close, let me say that there is no doubt in my mind that the future for Africa is bright. And investors know it. 2 weeks ago, we had the Africa Investment Forum in the city of Marrakesh in Morocco. We had over 1,000 people, investors from around the world that were there. We raised $34.8 billion of investment for Africa in less than 72 hours. And since we started it in 4 years ago, actually 2018, so 5 years ago, right now, we have helped to mobilize $177 billion of investment interest to Africa. That just tells you that Africa is bankable. Right here in Nigeria, look at what Dangote is doing. Phenomenal. I think we should clap for Dangote. I like people that have confidence in their own countries. We put in $400 million to support that. We put in another $400 million to support Indorama that is doing fertilizers in Nigeria. We put well over $200 million to support Bua, who is doing cement in the northwest of Nigeria. And in Nigeria, to date, the African Development Bank has put in $10 billion US. And please do tell President Tinubu that the African Development Bank strongly will back Nigeria and the reforms of Nigeria, because in those reforms lies our pathway out of the morass we are in today. So we see huge opportunities in Nigeria, and we believe in Nigeria. Ladies and gentlemen, excellencies, I am optimistic about Nigeria. I've always said this. God does not make mistakes. I was born as a Nigerian. I'll live as a Nigerian. I'll die as a Nigerian. And on the resurrection day, I'll ask God for permission to let me hold a green, white, green flag in my hand. I'm optimistic about Africa, and I believe in Africa. The African Development Bank itself, which is your bank, it's a great honor for me to be the first Nigerian ever to be president of the African Development Bank since 1964. And I thank God that last year, the African Development Bank was ranked as the best multilateral financial institution in the world. And this year, the African Development Bank was ranked as the most transparent financial institution in the world. That's the testimony of how you get respect and how you get recognition. All comes from doing the right things. So we now stand, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, at an intersection point in world history. Let's bring Africa's prosperous future into the present. A more prosperous Africa will be a more respected Africa. An Africa that unleashes its full potential. An Africa like a lighthouse at the harbor that will attract all ships to it. An Africa that cannot be ignored. An Africa that develops with pride. An Africa that asserts itself globally. An Africa that's a beacon of hope for all of its people. Together, let's be guardians of that hope for Africa. Together, we can make it happen. Thank you very much, and God bless you all.
You know, we are so glad about when people like this are a number of presidents who are just not only just words, a lot of action. Not just action, integrity, honesty. And really people, thank you, because situation will make me proud. Will make us proud. God bless you. We just didn't make a mistake. Make you man of the year. Important times. And do that more. God bless you. And my assignment just remarks about what we do further. And I welcome you all to this segment of today's event. Public presentation of what we call Guardian Federalist Papers. After we published 61 editions, like he said, I'm not even used to reading papers. For the over 30 years I taught, I did take the notes of that. It's better for me to speak without reading. So I will be in use of that, but I'm not going to waste of time. What we have done as a guidance is to talk about what we believe will make this country great. We had an opportunity in the past. We had a federation, proper federation, not this federation. Federation means that they are independent and look at their resources to grow. Now all we do is borrow money. And then our children, we were taught the moonlight things in those days. Our parents told us what to do. And they were really truthful. Now, everybody's doing money. We thank you one more time, the traditional, for what you are doing for us in Africa. For what you are doing for us in Nigeria. A continent like this should not be looking for power. God said, let that light. That was creation of that. And where is that light? Here. And who are in darkness? We. So something is wrong with us. So these are some of the reasons. I don't want to go into all the reasons we have to do several. I was trying to a publisher because I really want us to be monotonous. And then I told LG, let's adopt that thing. And we will be adequate. But by the time we start, people asking more questions and more questions and more questions. And LG stopped the policy. So then we can go on. The 61 is the period, number of years that we have been independent and poverty. It became the world political public. So really, the speaker, former Vice Chancellor also, who is in international affairs, will speak to us. I don't want to take my time. So I'm not going to look at this. It really doesn't matter. Thank you.
I have a long list of protocol on the state of aquatic splendor. It is our joy and pride that we, Lagos State, house the Guardian newspaper for its 40 years, and we are proud to let this go down history. Thank you. It is with great delight that I welcome captains of the media industry, eminent personalities, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, esteemed guests and colleagues to the coming of age of the iconic newspaper, the Guardian newspaper. Let me salute the great publisher herself, Lady Maiden Alex Ibru, for staunchly maintaining the dream of the founders of this flagship newsprint, supported by a dedicated team of staff and the board management. On behalf of the government and the good people of Lagos State, I wish you a happy anniversary. Mr. Governor would like me to let us know, I had said I will abridge his speech, that since the inception of the Guardian newspaper in 1983 to date, the paper has professionally carried out its reportage with an unusual grace and quite distinction, which qualities stands the Guardian out amongst her peers. The Guardian newspaper has achieved great esteem in and outside Nigeria as one of the most authoritative newspapers in Africa. Hence, it has been, thank you, please clap, it is the truth. Thank you. Hence, it has been aptly described as the flagship of the Nigerian press. And that is why today we celebrate its 40 years of outstanding, professional, impactful, resilient journalistic practice of the Guardian newspaper. You will all agree with me that the Guardian is a household name in Nigeria and Africa. In conclusion, let me once again heartily congratulate Lady Maiden Alex Ibru for the attainment of this laudable milestone with its credibility, integrity, and model intact. We're very certain that your husband, the late Mr. Alex Ibru of blessed memory, must be excited at the oak tree that this newspaper has become. Lagos is proud to be associated and to be your landlord always. Thank you. Thank you. On this note, I therefore wish you many more years of journalistic excellence, global understanding, and positive change. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Well-established protocols. So for people who like listening to my protocol list, not today. I bring you greetings and best wishes of His Excellency Prince Dapò Abiodun CON and the good people of Ogun State. It's a pleasure to be standing here today to commemorate the 40th anniversary of the Guardian newspapers, a beacon of journalism excellence in Nigeria. In celebrating this anniversary, we are also paying tribute to its founder and visionary, through the Africa Development Bank. We thank you for your leadership and your passion for Africa's growth. I acknowledge, on behalf of Ogun State, your support for us in various initiatives, and we host one of the special agro-processing zones which you referred to in your lecture. In Ogun State, we are changing the face of agriculture and improving the lives and livelihoods of our citizens in the agricultural value chain through this program. Ladies and gentlemen, we have heard that after the demise of her husband, Lady Maiden Alex Ibru stepped into the shoes of through turbulent times. Her unwavering commitment, astute decision-making, and visionary leadership ensured that the Guardian did not falter. To shaping our society. The Guardian's commitment to excellence, its dedication to the ideals of journalism, and its tireless efforts in upholding its reputation is truly commendable. It has played a crucial role in holding public figures accountable, exposing corruption, and championing social justice. It has been our conscience nurtured by truth. On behalf of the Governor, Prince Dapo Abiodun, CON, and the good people of Ogun State, I extend my heartfelt congratulations to the Guardian newspaper's family on its 40th anniversary. I salute the late Mr. Alex Ibru, Lady Maiden Alex Ibru, their children, and the dedicated team at the Guardian for their remarkable contribution to the media landscape. May the Guardian continue to inform, educate, and inspire generations to come as we look forward to its next 40 years. Thank you very much for listening, and good afternoon.
Well, this is a good message from Mr. President. Before I begin to just acknowledge our father here, Chief R.M. Shegun Shoba, and also the publisher of the Guardian, Lady Ibru. I also want to salute all the men and women that built the Guardian. Before I read the message, I want to say that I was a pioneer. And I remember it was very hard at the beginning when we started the Guardian. I joined went daily on July 4. I remember those days when we used to spend about, maybe in the office about 3 a.m., 4 a.m. for a go. Every crisis is there, was a witness at that time. And a lot of people sweated for the Guardian. Our guy then, Mr. Albo, was also around then, and it was really, really tough. So while we are saluting those who founded the Guardian, we should not forget those who also actually built, who laid the building blocks that made the Guardian what it is today. Mr. President said that I should apologize that I did not make it. Right now, he's trying to prepare for his budget speech tomorrow, and the day after, we're going to Dubai to attend the global conference on climate change. It gives me great pleasure, I'm giving the speech now, to be here today to share in the joy of the commemoration of the 40th anniversary of the Guardian newspapers. In February 1983, when the Guardian rolled out, Nigeria, as it turned out, was witnessing the last year of the Third Republic, which was effectively terminated by the military coup of 31 December 1983. The Guardian, which started as a weekly, went daily on 4 July 1983. Sometimes printed in color, it primarily served as the flagship of the Nigerian press, and distribution served from the back. It is magazine-like news reports, news features, and insightful editorials and opinions written by Nigeria's brightest intellectuals from our universities. In keeping faith with his motto, conscience nurtured by truth, two of the newspaper's correspondents, Nduka Irabo and Tunde Thompson, were jailed in 1984 under the Draconian Decree 4, which ignored truth as a defense in published reports. Under the Abacha junta, we also remember that the Guardian was shut down for many months. I must salute the industry and the resilience of the newspaper in surviving military rule and surviving so far the economic downturn and falling offline leadership as a result of the negative impact of technology on the industry. I have a confession to make. I read all our papers every day before leaving my bedroom. I therefore usually read the insightful and critical editorials published by The Guardian and other newspapers about our government. Let me say that I bear no grudges if our government is determined to lift forward our economy from a GDP of 450 billion to 1 trillion by 2030. The hard work to enable the realization of this goal has already begun. I shall return to this later in this address. On the issue of federalism, Professor Osage refining already converted. In my 34-year involvement in politics, I've been a federalist whose in his principles as enunciated by Chief Obafemi Awolowo from 1960 and his book published in 1966, Thoughts on the Nigerian Constitution. Thoughts on the Nigerian Constitution. I will believe that federalism is the best for Nigeria because nations multilingual, multi-religious, and multi-ethnic structure, as it will allow the sub-nationals to develop at their own pace without the intrusion of the central authorities. Although the 1960 Constitution says in Article 2, Section 2, that Nigeria shall be a federation consisting of states and a federal capital territory, many critics have the view that we have been operating a unitary constitution. As governor of Lagos, my administration shall challenge some of these assumptions. We and sometimes along with states with like minds approach the court with a bid to wrest some power from the central government and get judicial clarity on certain constitutional provisions. Some of the results of our efforts are now very clear for us. States can now generate power and distribute it. States can have real network of their own. In our action plan for a better Nigeria, as initiated in our renewed hope agenda, we devoted a whole chapter to federalism and decentralization of power, and pledged to balance the responsibilities and authorities of the different tiers of government. We pledged to collaborate with the National Assembly and the states to amend our national governance architecture so that states are afforded the autonomy and resources needed to better serve the people. We are committed to these objectives. And in due course, we ask the Revenue Mobilization, Allocation, and Fiscal Commission, our central government is overbearing or usurping what should be their powers. Provisions of the Constitution that need amendment should be submitted to the National Assembly, Constitution and other committees to make the states and the center function more effectively and optimally. Earlier this month, I ordered a review by a special committee of the Nigerian Police and the Police Act. Since its formation in 1861 and the coming into force of the 1999 Constitution, the Nigerian Police has faced innumerable shortcomings and has had little or no meaningful reforms. There's a very urgent need to strengthen it by enhancing its coordination, introducing technology, and beefing up its manpower resources. Amidst the general global economy, the national economy, an issue that affects all of us, our ambition to attain the 1 trillion economy appears daunting. We believe it is achievable with God on our side and our collective determination. We inherited more liabilities. As of June this year, this country has already committed about 98.9% of the revenue on debt service alone of revenue. So how much is left to do anything? So the Tinubu administration is putting his thinking cap to really turn a lot of things around. Yesterday, the Federal Council share approved the loan offer, that is the one by LBD, which is on constitutional terms for 25 years and grace period of 8 years. We have already embarked on fiscal reforms, which the Taiwo Ibele Presidential Committee on Fiscal Policy and Tax Reforms inaugurated on 8 August that based on 20 quick wins corrupt and wasteful fuel subsidy, which enable the Federation to make huge savings, which are being passed to all tiers of government by the Federation Account Allocation Committee by way of increased allocations. We are also determined to unify the foreign exchange market rate and stop the criminal arbitrage of the past. To arrive at the 1 trillion economic destination, we believe that sooner than later, to borrow the Guardian marketing mantra 40 years ago, we must address the capital adequacy of our banks that will provide the fuel for this journey. Let me use this opportunity to appeal to Nigerians to exercise some patience. The economic reforms we are implementing come with some pains. The pains are temporary, and as we shall soon begin to feel the positive impact of the reforms. Once again, again, I congratulate the Guardian for its 40th anniversary, and I wish the Guardian many, many more years of celebration. Thank you for this.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Bayo Nonoga, representing the President of the Federal Republic, President Bola Ahmed Tinubu. Well, now we're going to move very fast.
National affairs, we are very delighted to be playing host to the Guardian at 40. We congratulate the answer. What is the question? Now, I thought this one suggested another round of confusion, creating a conundrum that in 1982 led my teacher and senior colleague, Professor John Ayoade, to write a monograph entitled Federalism in Nigeria, the Worship of an Unknown God. And he was simply saying that, many times you listen to debates, you read, contributions from people, and you wonder if the people know what they are talking about. So his confusion was, even those who advocate for federalism don't even have a sense of what they are saying. And so when you say it is the answer, but what is the question, you are further complexifying that conundrum. Now imagine for 1 minute the proposition that says if A then B, where B is the answer to A. And you are saying that B would be true irrespective of what A is. In other words, irrespective of what the question is, B would be invariantly true. Now that in itself has to have a form of illogicality, except we want to argue, and we can prove, that B would be the answer to all A, notwithstanding the conditions or problems raised by A. Now, would that be true of federalism, for instance, with all of the problems that we know of federalism and the fact that its success is not always guaranteed? Would such a system be a ready answer and solution to all that we want to deal with? So I thought we should go to the bag of wisdom of the famous and legendary tortoise and get what he would say. And part of the recommendations he would get from that bag of skills and wisdom would be working from the answer to the question. And that is what I think would make sense. If you brought the whole world to this same hall and had an international conference on federalism. Now, that conference led to the publication of a 1979 classic entitled Readings on Federalism, edited by Bolaji Akinyemi, Patrick Dele Cole, and Walter Ofonakoro. Now, that was a 1979 publication. That conference was very significant because that long ago, the world took Africa and Nigeria in particular so seriously that it believed we had things to contribute to the world of learning. Now, how be it in 2023, several years after, we no longer are considered worthy of such contributions. To the contrary, we now get invited to all kinds of summits where people tell us about ourselves, and we are hardly allowed to speak for ourselves. So I'm glad that President Adesina has made the point that we should have a reversal, and the NIA stands strongly for that summits on Africa must happen in Africa. And the NIA has provided a platform for this reversal. Conundrum. African state as a state that is neither African nor state. So, in that book, my simple argument is that what is failing in Africa, what is fragile in Africa, is the colonial inheritance. That state that we have, that is neither African nor state, is decomposing. And the fact of that decomposition has been accelerated by the second independence movement that you find all through the corners of Africa. In Nigeria, it takes the form of separatist agitations.
It takes the form of terrorism. It takes the form of violent extremism. It takes the form of secessionist movements. These are movements questioning the sanctity and tenability of the colonial state. And that dissolution is already underway. Again, it reinforces the need for federalism, because a new state that would be the solution to the failure and disappearance of the colonial state, what in essence would then be the post-colonial state in its organic form, will be one that needs to be rebargained and renegotiated. There is no substitute for doing so except federalism. My third and nearer home to this particular conundrum was the inaugural that I delivered at the University of Ibadan. To solve existential problems in a way that has been designed not to fail. But you know, when you have a human contrivance, the chances are that there will be imperfections and there will be problems. But federalism is a very delicate system that requires very delicate balancing to survive and to work. This is the argument. And so when the Guardian papers would say and argue that federalism is the answer, yes, to what problem? It is to the problem of the management of diversity. That's correct. And so we can begin to see that the Guardian papers are taking us back to a root that is very fundamental to the existence of federalism. You cannot have federalism without federalists. You need people who understand federalism. You need people who would advocate for it. You need people who would defend it. And that is the role that I see the Guardian papers playing today. For those of us who want to go a little deeper, you will find that even in the United States of America, at the 1787 Philadelphia Convention, there were those who wrote the Federalist Papers and went around mobilizing support for why a united and integrated America would be better than a divided America. So what you have as American federalism today has such very, very mobilized foundations by federalists who were truly federalists. For a long time, our federalists have disappeared in Nigeria. So maybe the Guardian is beginning a process of resuscitating the federalist movement, committing these things to work. In 61 outings, 61 writings that make up this book, the Guardian has argued that federalism is the most appropriate and suitable system for Nigeria. I don't think many of us would disagree with that. However, I think that federalism still needs to be further understood. And the problem that I would just mention in the few minutes that I have is that the essence of federalism is not to be found in the federal constitution only. The essence of federalism is not to be found in federal government. The congeries of solutions that federalism provides requires greater innovativeness, creativity, adaptability in terms of solving problems. But to say that American federalism, like Casey Ware argued a long time ago, is the beginning and the end of federalism is simply to miss the point. Because what is true of America can never be true of Nigeria. Many people don't realize it, that with over 250 ethnic groups in our country, there is no country else in the world that is exactly like Nigeria. So the kind of federalism that will work in Nigeria is not federalism that, thrives on a federal constitution that is crafted in America and borrowed and imported to our land to fit the circumstances that are incongruent with those of the United States. Every federal situation, to the extent of its context, its historicity, and its political economy, has the federalism that suits in circumstances. So for one federal situation, if you find the instrumentalities that work for you, that is true federalism. True federalism is a contextual variable, and that contextuality is what defines federalism. So, the essence of federalism, William Livingston argued in 1952, is not to be found in the Constitution. It is rather to be found in the nature of society served by that Constitution. So, a sociological approach that says, what are the imperatives that need to be addressed? That is what I advocate. In most of these 61 outings by the Guardian, you will find almost article after article enamoring the so-called perfection of the 1963 Constitution. Now think of the 1963 Constitution. This was a constitution, many people don't remember, that had provision for emergency powers under which the federal government could take over the affairs of regions. And the sacking of the action group from the Western region owed a lot to that possibility, which was actualized. This was a constitution that allowed the regional commissioner of police to take orders from the inspector general of police, the same things that we say today. This was a constitution that had many of the problems that we have today, suggesting to us that we needed a lot more than just what the constitutional provisions, had for us. But let me even suggest to us that the greatest problem that our constitution faced in that first republic was not that we didn't have a good constitutional order. In addition to the central constitution, we had regional constitutions. But Nigeria failed a more fundamental federalism test, which is embodied in the J.S. Mill's law of federal instability. According to this law, if it is the case that one or a few component units of a federation have so much power that they can lord it over the rest of the country, of the federation, that federation would be perennially unstable. It cannot last long. The problem we had bedeviling our federalism that long ago, and many still think it's bedeviling us today, is the fact that people feared domination. They still fear domination. At the national level, we have the fear of national domination. Within the constituent units, minorities also feared the domination of majority groups. And those problems remain with us. But let me just quickly put all of this in perspective in terms of the changing instrumentalities that W.A. Livingston talked about. We had, up until 1966, a region-centered federal trajectory, meaning that we had regions that were not just simply autonomous, but they were described as independent states in a primitive international system. That's how divided the regions were. It was the West for Westerners, East for Easterners, and the North for Northerners. For Nigeria, everyone, maybe the minorities will contend, but everyone wanted to be autonomous. And so they were. In 1967, we fought a civil war, which was like the logical conclusion of the divisiveness that had eaten Nigerian federalism up. So the military thought for a minute that the only way to save this country and to redeem it was to tweak the nature of our federal solution and move rapidly from a region-centered federal trajectory to a nation-centered federal trajectory. And that was the transition that we had, which was fully paid for by the Rikefe panel report, which in 1976, in recommending that we move from a 12-state structure to a 19-state structure, said the following, that it is no longer necessary for any constituent unit of Nigeria to be viable, because the whole essence of viability now is a function of the viability of the central government. As long as the central government is viable, the country and its constituent units will be viable. That's where we are today. Now, that nation-centered trajectory of federalism brought us from a production-based federalism to a consumer-based federalism. So everything that should be productive is now seen only in terms of, first, consumption, second, entitlement, which is actually a recipe for indolence. So rather than be productive, all that you need to do is to get a strategic advantage, what the economists call comparative advantage, by ensuring that you have a succession to power. Now, what I hear federalism as answer saying is that we are at that intersection where we need to tweak our federal instrumentalities again. We need to get back to things that approximate the era where state viability was a major consideration in the disaggregation of our federal system. The present centralized or hyper-centralized instrumentalities can no longer suffice. We need to work out new frameworks for our federalism. Now, and I'm saying that in working out the new framework, it cannot simply and only be about the Constitution. We need to talk about the strengths that have come the way of Nigeria through how far we have gone with the federal political culture of accommodation and resilience and tolerance and win-win for everyone that would allow us all get into new magical forms of bargaining and renegotiation. The ones that will then make the state that will emerge a state exactly the way we want it, a state of our own where everyone finds a just and equitable cause to be part and parcel of that. The days when we would have thought that we can have a highly decentralized or denationalized or non-centralized federal system, those days are gone. The present nation-state trajectory supports only centralized states. And that's one reason why the executive branch of government has dominated nation-states today. That's why the president of every country appears like the only one who can talk for the country. But if we want to have a country where all of us can find a space, I will refer us to the article that Martin Zoloja wrote after his most recent visit to Akwa Ibom State, where he said, I have seen that federalism is the answer after all. What did he see? He saw a state.
Comparative politics.
The directors, the family in general, and the chairman of the Federal Public elder director, legal family, and we take the pictures in churches. Family members of the general will also there. The editor, past editors and present editor will there. Now we have Minister of Interior. The great memory of the great founder, the dictionary publisher, Mr. Aristotle. May his soul continue to rest in perfect peace.